He leaned over the map and said, "If we keep moving, they don't recover." Eisenhower didn't shout. He didn't argue like a rival. He just stared at the thin line behind Patton's arrows and replied, "We can't support you if you go any farther." Patton's jaw tightened. He didn't need a lecture. He needed permission. He said, "Then they survive." That was the moment. Not the famous halt people talk about later. Not the headlines. Not the speeches. The moment the truth was said out loud in a quiet room and set aside anyway. Because by late August 1944, the war in France didn't feel like a war. It felt like a building collapse. German units weren't forming a new line. They were breaking into pieces. Convoys without air cover, columns without orders, rear guards firing a few shots and then vanishing east. American patrols drove into towns marked contested on yesterday's maps and found German helmets left behind in the streets. That's the kind of moment that ends wars early, and Patton knew it. His Third Army wasn't advancing like a normal army. It was pouring through a crack. When an enemy is running like that, you don't push, you chase. You keep pressure so hard, the enemy never gets a clean breath. Patton believed one thing more than anything else. Speed saves lives. Not because it looks heroic, because speed makes the enemy confused. And a confused enemy can't build a wall. But inside Allied headquarters, something ugly was happening. Not at the front, behind it. Fuel was vanishing. Not running low, vanishing. Because the Allies had planned for a hard fight across France. A slow grind, a step-by-step crawl. They did not plan for Patton to break the map. Every mile Patton gained meant trucks had to drive farther. Gas had to travel farther. Ammo had to travel farther. And the roads behind him were not magical highways. They were narrow French roads, bridges, bottlenecks. One breakdown could jam everything. There was an American trucking system running day and night to feed the front. Men later called it the Red Ball Express. Those drivers were not heroes in movie posters. They were exhausted men in dusty cabs, running routes without sleep. They drove too fast. They drove in the dark. They drove with broken lights and overloaded trucks. They stole hours from their own bodies so tanks could keep rolling. And even that wasn't enough. Because Patton wasn't consuming fuel at the rate planners predicted. He was consuming it like fire. A tank is not a horse. You can't push it farther on willpower. When it stops, it stops. Patton's staff saw the warnings and refused to feel them. Every new town taken felt like proof. Another German column captured. Another bridge taken intact. Another road open. And every time Patton stayed fast, the Germans stayed weak. That's the false certainty. Everyone in the Allied command began to believe the same lie. If the Germans are running today, they'll run tomorrow. But speed creates a trap. Because speed doesn't just outrun the enemy. It outruns your own system. And the Allied system was starting to fail. Not in one dramatic crash, in quiet panic. Supply officers begging for priority. Units siphoning fuel from each other. Truck drivers missing sleep for days. Some commanders were still celebrating. Others were doing math. Eisenhower was doing math. He wasn't blind to the opportunity. That's what people get wrong. He could see the same battlefield reports Patton could see. German units disengaging before contact. Captured officers admitting they had one order: get east. This wasn't resistance, it was escape. Eisenhower understood what Patton understood. If the Allies kept moving, the German army might never recover in the West. So why didn't he unleash Patton? because Eisenhower wasn't commanding one man. He was commanding an alliance. If Patton surged ahead, someone else would fall behind. And in this war, falling behind wasn't just a military problem. It was political. If Patton got everything, Montgomery got nothing. If Montgomery got nothing, Britain looked powerless. If Britain looked powerless, the alliance cracked. And the alliance was the only reason the Western Front existed at all. So the war reached a moment where victory was not the only fear. The fear was losing control of the victory. That is what sat behind Eisenhower's calm voice when he said, "We can't support you." It wasn't a complaint. It was a warning. Patton heard caution. Eisenhower meant collapse. Because if Patton's spearheads ran out of fuel too far forward, they wouldn't just stop. They'd be stranded. Not for an hour. Not for a day. Long enough for the Germans to do what desperate armies always do. Pick a place, strike the thin part, cut the road, and turn the fastest advance in France into a trap. That was the room. One man looking at open roads. One man looking at the single thread holding an army to its fuel. And a decision that would not explode immediately. There would be no dramatic collapse, no headline screaming disaster. The war would continue, just slower, heavier, more expensive. And that cost would come due later. This wasn't a clash of personalities. It was a clash of identities. Patton and Eisenhower did not want different outcomes. They wanted the war to end. They wanted Germany beaten. They wanted American soldiers alive. But they believed in opposite paths to get there. Patton believed war rewarded nerve. That hesitation killed more men than risk. That once an enemy started breaking, you chased him until he forgot how to fight. His entire career was built on that idea. From North Africa to Sicily to France, Patton had watched the same pattern repeat. When pressure stayed constant, the enemy cracked. When pressure eased, the enemy adapted. Patton did not see speed as recklessness. He saw it as protection. Every mile gained fast was a mile the enemy couldn't fortify. Every hour without pause denied German commanders time to think. And thinking was what made armies dangerous again. That belief shaped how Patton looked at maps. He didn't see supply lines first. He saw opportunities, open roads, undefended bridges, enemy arrows pointing backward instead of forward. To him, France in August 1944 was a gift, one that would not last. Eisenhower looked at the same maps and saw something else. He saw a system under strain. He had spent years preparing for this war, years coordinating shipping schedules, depot locations, fuel forecasts, replacement flows. The Allied invasion was not just an army, it was a machine. And machines break when one part outruns the rest. Eisenhower was not afraid of German counterattacks because he thought Patton was weak. He was afraid because he knew how thin success could become when it stretched too far. Behind Patton's Third Army was not a wall of steel. It was a fragile chain. Trucks, fuel dumps, repair units, engineers fixing bridges as fast as bombs destroyed them. And that chain was already fraying. Omar Bradley could see it clearly. He commanded the First Army, advancing on a different axis, facing different pressures. Bradley was not racing through open countryside. He was grinding forward, step by step. And as Patton surged ahead, resources flowed toward him. Fuel, trucks, priority. Bradley understood what that meant. If Patton kept getting everything, someone else would get nothing. This wasn't jealousy. It was arithmetic. The Allied supply system could not fully support two armies moving at maximum speed. Something had to give. And then there was Montgomery. Even when he wasn't in the room, he was in the room. Montgomery commanded British forces whose prestige mattered politically. Eisenhower could not openly sideline him without consequences far beyond the battlefield. If Patton became the sole engine of victory, Britain would look like a passenger in a war it had been fighting since 1939. Eisenhower had been chosen for this job because he could manage men like Patton and Montgomery without letting them tear the alliance apart. That was his real battlefield. Patton saw none of that as his problem. His job, as he saw it, was to destroy the enemy. Politics could follow. Eisenhower saw the opposite. If the alliance broke, there would be no victory to manage afterward. This is where the pressure began to build. Patton pushed for priority fuel, more trucks, more freedom. His staff sent messages arguing that every delay strengthened the enemy. Behind those messages was a simple truth. Patton was winning faster than the plan allowed. Eisenhower read the same reports Patton did. He did not deny the collapse of German resistance. He did not dispute the opportunity. What he disputed was whether the Allied system could survive exploiting it. This was the false certainty both sides lived inside. Patton believed the system would stretch if pushed. Eisenhower believed it would snap. And once a system snaps in war, you don't get a second chance to rebuild it. So the escalation wasn't loud. There were no slammed fists, no shouting matches. It was quieter than that. Requests slowed. Approvals took longer. Allocations tightened. Patton felt resistance without hearing the word no. And Eisenhower felt the weight of a choice that could not be shared. Because if Patton failed, it would be Eisenhower's failure. If the alliance cracked, it would be Eisenhower's name attached to it. The war had reached a point where winning faster meant risking everything else. And both men knew it. They just could not agree on which risk was worse. The confrontation did not arrive as a single order. That's the mistake people make when they look back. They imagine a moment where Eisenhower slammed a fist on the table and said, "Stop." That never happened. What happened was worse. The system began to say no. Fuel requests that once sailed through approval now came back delayed. Truck allocations were adjusted. Priorities were rebalanced. No one told Patton he was being slowed. They just made it impossible for him to keep going the way he had been. That was the collision. Patton felt it first at the front. Columns that should have been moving stalled. Units waited longer for fuel. Artillery that was supposed to keep pace lagged behind. Patton knew immediately what this meant. He was not naive about logistics. He had commanded armies long enough to understand how war really worked. But he believed logistics existed to serve momentum, not restrain it. He sent messages demanding clarity, not polite ones. He argued that the Germans were still disorganized, that every hour mattered, that slowing now meant fighting harder later. He warned in his own blunt language that hesitation would cost lives. Eisenhower did not deny any of it. That's what made the confrontation unbearable. Because Eisenhower agreed with the diagnosis. He simply rejected the prescription. He looked at the same reports and saw danger, not opportunity. German armor was still alive. Artillery units were falling back into prepared terrain. Engineers were blowing bridges behind the retreat. The Third Army was now hundreds of miles from its main depots. In some sectors, its lifeline narrowed to a handful of roads. One cut road, one successful counterattack, And Patton's spearheads would not just pause, they would be trapped. This was not paranoia, it was history. Eisenhower had studied armies that advanced faster than their support. They always paid the same price. He did not believe Patton was reckless. He believed Patton was outrunning protection. So Eisenhower made the choice he had been trying to avoid. He imposed control. Not loudly, not publicly, quietly. The Red Ball Express kept running, but its capacity was capped. Fuel was redirected. Other fronts were protected. The Allied advance was forced back into alignment. This was the last moment to fix it. If Eisenhower had bent the system just a little longer, if he had let Patton pull farther ahead, the German retreat might never have stabilized. But bending the system meant admitting the plan was wrong. It meant betting the alliance on one commander's instinct. And Eisenhower was not willing to do that. That was the point of no return. Once fuel was capped, momentum died. Not instantly, but steadily. Patton could still attack. He could still fight, but he could no longer flow. And flow was what had broken the Germans in France. Now the enemy had time. German commanders noticed the change almost immediately. Their retreat slowed. Rear guards stiffened. Artillery found positions that hadn't existed days earlier. They were no longer running blindly east. They were choosing where to stop. Patton watched this happen in real time. To him, it was proof of everything he had warned about. The Germans weren't stronger. They were breathing. And once an army breathes, it fights. Eisenhower watched something else. He watched casualty projections stabilize. He watched supply lines hold. He watched the Allied machine stop tearing itself apart. From his perspective, restraint was working. From Patton's perspective, restraint was killing the future. Both men could point to the same maps and see confirmation of their beliefs. That is what made the confrontation so bitter. There was no clear villain, no obvious mistake in the moment. Just a decision that locked the war into a different shape. A faster end had been possible. So had a catastrophic failure. Eisenhower chose to eliminate the second risk. And in doing so, he accepted the first. The Germans were no longer collapsing. They were reorganizing. And the war was about to change. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They arrived mile by mile, day by day. As August turned into September, the shape of the war changed. Patton's Third Army kept moving forward, but it no longer surged. The long columns that had once rolled without stopping now stacked up behind rivers and blown bridges. Engineers worked under fire to build crossings that should never have mattered in a pursuit. The Germans noticed immediately. They were no longer being chased. They were being approached. That difference mattered. Around the Moselle River and across Lorraine, German commanders began doing something they had not been able to do for weeks. They chose where to fight. Instead of scattering, they anchored themselves to terrain that punished speed. Hills, rivers, old fortifications that turned tanks into targets. Places where time favored the defender. Metz became the symbol of that change. For centuries, armies had bled against it. And now, with the Allied advance slowed, German command decided it would be held. Not because Metz was vital, but because it was useful. It was a place where American momentum could be broken. Patton attacked anyway. He had not lost his will. He had lost his conditions. Tanks reached the river without enough fuel to maneuver freely. Infantry went forward without the artillery support that had protected them in France. Air cover was stretched thin as bases lagged behind the front. What followed was not a dramatic defeat. It was worse. Attrition. Fighting that ground down units without delivering decisive results. Battles that consumed men and machines without collapsing the enemy. American after-action reports from Lorraine tell the same story again and again. Strong resistance, prepared positions, heavy casualties. This was not the enemy Patton had been racing through weeks earlier. The Germans were no longer improvising. They were planning. From Eisenhower's perspective, this was exactly what he had feared, but also what he had tried to prevent. The Third Army was not annihilated. It was not cut off. The system held. From his point of view, control had saved an army. From Patton's point of view, the cost was unbearable. Units that should have been racing into Germany were now bogged down in fights that did not need to exist. Every casualty felt like a debt created by hesitation. German commanders later admitted what they saw. They could not beat American forces in open country, but given time, they could bleed them. Lorraine gave them that time, and they used it. September turned into October. Rain came. Mud followed. Roads that had once carried convoys now swallowed them. Vehicles broke down faster than they could be repaired. Fuel shortages became routine instead of exceptional. Patton's army kept fighting, but the war he believed in was gone. This was no longer a pursuit. It was a grind. Eisenhower watched casualty figures climb and told himself the alternative could have been worse. A trapped army, a shattered alliance, a disaster that would have overshadowed every victory that came before it. Patton watched the same figures and believed the disaster had already happened, just slower. He wrote bitterly about lost chances, about how the Germans had been given time they did not deserve, about how speed had been sacrificed to safety. Neither man was lying. They were simply counting different costs. Eisenhower counted the army that still existed. Patton counted the lives spent fighting battles that should never have been fought. The consequence of the decision was not failure. It was endurance. A war that had briefly looked like it might end early settled back into its old rhythm. Push. Pause. Pay. The fastest army in Europe was forced to fight like every other army before it. Not because it lacked courage, not because it lacked skill, but because time had been returned to the enemy. And once time is given back in war, it never comes cheaply. The war did not end in Lorraine. That is the judgment history forces on this decision. After Metz, after the Moselle, after the blood and mud, the Third Army fought on. It crossed into Germany. It smashed through later defenses. It helped finish the Reich. But something fundamental had changed. The illusion was gone. The belief that the war could be ended by speed alone died in Lorraine. Patton never accepted that. In his letters, in his diary, in conversations long after the guns fell silent, he returned to the same idea again and again. Speed saves lives. Delay kills them. To Patton, the supply crisis was not proof that the system had protected him. It was proof that the system had failed to adapt fast enough. He believed the Allies had stumbled onto a moment of collapse and then flinched. That the German army in the West had been wounded and allowed to heal. In Patton's mind, Lorraine was not inevitable. It was manufactured. A fortress that only existed because time had been given back. Eisenhower never apologized, and that matters. In his post-war accounts, he did not describe regret. He described responsibility. He wrote about coalitions, about how wars are not won by single commanders, no matter how brilliant, about how armies collapse not only from enemy action, but from overstretch. To Eisenhower, the miracle was not that Patton had been slowed. It was that Patton's army survived at all. He believed that control had prevented a catastrophe no one would have forgiven him for. If the Third Army had been cut off deep in France, if German armor had found its supply line, if an American army had been surrounded and destroyed, no one would have praised speed. They would have blamed recklessness. Eisenhower accepted the slower war because it was a war he could guarantee finishing. That is the unresolved truth at the center of this story. Both men were right, and both men paid. Patton paid by watching the kind of war he excelled at disappear. He paid by fighting a slower, uglier campaign that consumed men he believed could have been spared. Eisenhower paid by carrying the weight of a decision that ensured victory but multiplied its cost. The long shadow of that choice stretched far beyond Lorraine. It shaped how the Allies fought through the fall of 1944. It shaped the winter that followed. It shaped a war that dragged into mud, snow, and attrition, instead of collapsing under momentum. The Ardennes would come. Germany would gamble again. And the war would remind everyone that unfinished enemies do not stay unfinished forever. This was not a story about cowardice. It was a story about control. Eisenhower chose a war he could manage over a war that might end faster, but spiral beyond his grasp. That choice saved an army. It also saved Germany from collapse in the West, long enough for thousands more men to die. History never gave Eisenhower and Patton a verdict they could both accept, because the question this decision raises has no clean answer. Is it better to risk everything to end a war quickly, or to accept a longer war to avoid catastrophe? The ground around Lorraine answered only one thing. Wars do not forgive hesitation, but they punish recklessness even harder. And somewhere between those two truths, an entire army waited for fuel. An enemy found time to recover. And the fastest advance in Europe slowed into a grind that did not need to exist. That decision mattered. People paid for it. And the cost is still written on the map.